Imagine a massive suspension bridge just collapses.
Right.
And in the aftermath, everyone starts pointing fingers, right?
Yeah.
You blame the chief architect, or maybe you blame the quality of the materials.
Yeah, or you look for a corrupt politician who cut funding.
Exactly. But what if the true villain, the actual oppressor of the whole story, is just a guy in a workshop miles away?
A guy who just didn't do his job.
Right. A guy who decided not to thread a single metal nut properly just because he was having a bad day and, well, he simply didn't care.
I mean, that completely shifts the entire landscape of how we understand accountability.
It really does.
Because we usually reserve a heavy word like oppression for, dictatorships or grand sweeping historical atrocities. We picture systemic failures that you can see from space.
Yeah, the really obvious massive stuff.
Exactly. But reducing it to a single unthreaded nut in a hardware store, that forces us to look right in the mirror.
And that is exactly the paradigm shift we're exploring today in this deep dive. Welcome in, by the way.
Glad to be here.
Our mission today is to unpack a really fascinating, deeply philosophical text. It's an essay and an accompanying poem titled Direction, Walking the Truth, Opposite Oppression.
It's a dense read, but totally worth it.
Absolutely. We want to understand how this source redefines massive, kind of intimidating concepts like justice and legacy and brings them all the way down to the completely unexpected everyday mechanics of our own lives.
Yeah, right down to the nuts and bolts. Literally.
Literally. So the author uses a specific term early on, right? Is to commit.
Right, is to commit, which on a basic level translates to direction.
Okay.
But the text frames it as much more than just, a heading on a compass. It actually describes justice as a sharp sword that carves the istiqamet, the definitive trajectory of humanity.
Wow, a sharp sword.
Yeah. It's really about what it means to actually leave a mark, a deliberate groove in the world. But before we can even begin carving that direction, the text is super insistent that we have to dismantle the illusions we've just accepted about reality.
Right. Okay, let's unpack this. The author calls this the trap of de facto situations.
Yes. And they identify this as literally the single greatest danger on the path of humanity.
The greatest danger. That's a huge claim.
It is, but a de facto situation is basically a reality created entirely by repetition and normalization.
Okay, I think I see where this is going.
The text argues that just because a wrong is committed by thousands of people, or just because an illegality has continued for, decades, time and popularity do not magically transform that wrong into truth.
I mean, we see this constantly in everyday life. You hear people say, oh, everyone pads their expense reports, or that's just how the industry operates.
Or everyone speeds on this stretch of highway.
Exactly. The longevity of a bad habit essentially becomes its own justification.
Right. And the text points out that this literally rewires our moral framework. When a society just accepts a de facto wrong, it creates this weird parallel reality.
Where the illegal feels legal just because of social friction.
Exactly. It's just easier to go along with it than to challenge it. But the author cuts right through this complacency by stating there is absolutely no average injustice.
Yeah. They use a remarkably stark analogy for this.
They do. They say being somewhat just is as impossible as being somewhat pregnant.
It's such a vivid image, but I have to say, I struggle with the practicality of it a bit.
How so?
Well, if justice has absolutely zero gray area you are either just or unjust with no middle ground, what does that mean for the minor daily compromises we all make just to survive?
You mean in a highly complex, flawed society?
Yeah. Does a small, forced compromise automatically make someone an oppressor? Because, that feels like an impossibly heavy burden for just a normal person trying to pay their rent.
It is an immense burden, and the text really doesn't apologize for that weight at all.
Really?
Yeah, the source actually provides a radical redefinition of oppression to explain exactly why that middle ground is a total myth.
Okay, lay it on me.
Well, oppression isn't just the physical torture of a political dissident. The author explicitly states that it is oppression to withhold a job from a competent person who deserves it.
Oh, wow.
It's oppression to betray trust. And perhaps most chillingly, it's oppression to wound a person's dignity with a flippant attitude.
Wait. So being dismissive or rolling your eyes, being careless with someone's inherent worth that is categorized on the exact same spectrum as tyranny.
Yes. It's all the exact same rot, just at different stages of decay.
That is heavy.
A flippant attitude towards someone's dignity is the seed. Tyranny is just the fully grown tree.
So they're fundamentally the same thing.
Exactly. The text argues that the moment you compromise on justice, you aren't just, taking a temporary break from it. You are actively participating in the mechanics of oppression. Justice either manifests fully or it collapses entirely into arbitrariness.
Okay, so if even a minor compromise makes us complicit, we are left with a pretty terrifying standard. How can an individual actually navigate the world without becoming part of that rot? Like, what do we do?
Well, the author doesn't just leave us with the diagnosis. They actually introduce a specific toolkit for survival.
Right. They call it the Trinity of Truth. Let's get into that.
Yeah, so truth, according to the text, only becomes visible and actionable when these three specific elements are present together.
And those are competence, trust, and virtue.
Right. Without all three acting in total unison, truth just remains theoretical, or worse, it gets weaponized.
Okay, competence is straightforward enough, I think. The text calls it the proficiency or the equipment needed to walk the path.
Basically, you have to actually possess the skills to do the job you claim you can do.
Right. Then there is trust, or trustworthiness. The author defines this as the ability to tune your back to the person beside you.
It's like the ultimate trust fall, but elevated to a life or death philosophy.
Exactly. Being entrusted with something and never betraying it. Let's look at how competence and trust interact first, though, because I think a lot of people assume that if you are highly skilled and generally a trustworthy person, you're pretty much good to go.
A really helpful way to understand the relationship between competence and trust is to think of them kind of like a financial system.
Okay, I like analogies.
So competence is the physical gold sitting in the vault.
It has intrinsic value.
Right. It's the actual ability to build the bridge or write the code or perform the surgery. Trust, on the other hand, is the paper money circulating out in society.
So it only has value because people believe the gold is actually in the vault.
Exactly.
And if the vault is empty, like if there is absolutely no competence, then all that circulating trust is basically a massive societal Ponzi scheme.
That's a great way to put it. People might trust you completely because, you're a nice person. But when the crisis hits, the bridge still falls down. And conversely, if you have a vault completely full of gold, immense competence but zero trust, well, society can't function either.
Because no one will trade with you.
Right. Think about a brilliant con artist. They're highly competent at what they do, but they actively destroy the paper money of society.
Which is exactly why the third element of the Trinity is so critical. The text calls it virtue, or in the original framing, vakar.
Yes, vakar, which also translates to caliber or armor.
The text describes it as an armor that protects your integrity. It defines it as the willingness to not deviate from the path, even if there is absolutely zero profit at the end.
That's the key part, zero profit.
But I'm curious what that actually looks like in practice. Is vakar just about breaking even? Or does it mean actively taking a loss to maintain your direction?
True, vakar almost always involves a penalty. It costs you something.
Okay, going back to our financial analogy.
Right, so if competence is the gold and trust is the paper money, vakar is the vault itself.
The structural integrity.
Exactly. It's the structural integrity of a person's soul. Imagine you have a CEO who's brilliant at their job, so highly competent.
Lots of gold.
Lots of gold. And they are universally trusted by their employees, lots of valid paper money. But then a massive market crash happens.
Wow.
And the board demands some really unethical layoffs just to protect short-term shareholder profits.
So the crisis actively tests the vault.
That's it, exactly.
Huh.
If that CEO lacks vakar, they will fold under the pressure. They'll make the compromise just to save their own lucrative bonus.
And then what happens?
Their competence is suddenly being used to exploit people, and the trust their employees had in them is instantly betrayed. The gold is looted.
Man, that's brutal.
Virtue is the armor that ensures your competence is actually used for truth, and that the trust placed in you is never, ever sold out, regardless of the personal cost.
Okay, so we've established the tools required to maintain truth. But the author doesn't stop there. They pivot to look at what happens when this trinity is abandoned. And this brings us back to the metaphor we started with. This is where it gets really interesting because it anchors this high-level, lofty philosophy straight into physical reality. The grooveless nut.
It's such a striking image. The author explicitly categorizes incompetence and arbitrariness as active forms of oppression.
Active forms.
Yes. The essay states that a mindset declaring, "I will produce a grooveless nut," bears the complete moral responsibility for the accidents, the collapsed buildings, and the lost lives wherever that faulty product is ultimately used.
But let me challenge the severity of this for a second.
Sure.
Because the concept of arbitrariness,
Yeah.
just doing whatever you want without standard or care, is framed here as a violent act against truth.
The poem actually says arbitrariness is a hammer, truth takes the jolt.
Right. But does this mean every single exhausted, overworked, minimum wage employee who makes a minor mistake on an assembly line is suddenly an oppressor?
That's a really important question.
Are we really holding the lowest rung of society responsible for the collapse of the bridge?
No, and that distinction is crucial here. The text isn't condemning honest human fatigue or an accidental error.
Okay.
It targets the mindset of arbitrariness. The explicit, conscious thought of, I know this isn't right, but I simply do not care. I did it, so it's done.
I did it, so it's done. That's so common.
It's a toxic logic, prioritizing speed over integrity, quantity over quality. It's basically a modern plague.
So the overworked employee making a genuine mistake is a victim of a systemic failure.
Exactly. But the person who actively decides to strip the threads off a metal nut just because it saves them 3 seconds of effort, that person is actively embracing the mindset of the oppressor.
Because they are actively severing the web of trust. Think about it. Modern society relies entirely on these invisible threads of reliance.
You don't even notice them until they snap.
Right. Like, I have to trust that the mechanic actually tightened the brakes on my car. I have to trust that the engineer properly calculated the load-bearing capacity of the building I'm sitting in right now.
Right, you can't verify everything yourself.
When arbitrariness replaces competence, that entire web is just compromised. The grooveless nut becomes this, microscopic black hole that pulls everything down.
And the author actually elevates this from a simple mechanical failure to a cosmic one.
How so?
There's an incredibly profound line in the poem that goes, "All things in their rightful place, the world turns in grace. Even matter weeps when the balance leave its place."
Oh, wow. Even matter weeps. The physical universe itself mourns when we lack the Vagar to put things together correctly.
Yeah. It implies this deep, deep interconnectedness between physical engineering and spiritual morality.
That's a beautiful way to phrase it.
A lack of care in our daily work isn't just a breach of contract, it is a fundamental act of violence against the balance of society. If the balance shifts even a grain, oppression floods into the gap where justice faded.
So if a grooveless nut inevitably leads to the collapse of the machine, what is the ultimate fate of the person producing it?
The author contrasts two very distinct paths for human life here.
Right, the jellyfish and the grooved legacy. And I have to say, calling someone a jellyfish in the context of this philosophy is just a devastatingly potent insult.
It's brutal. It really is. The text acknowledges that those who chase arbitrariness, the ones cutting corners and producing grooveless nuts, they often appear to win in the short term.
Oh, totally. They get the promotion, they save money, they navigate those de facto situations with ease.
Right, but their ultimate fate is to be carried by what the author calls a spineless current.
The poem describes them arriving as a hollow, transparent drift, like a jellyfish washing up on the shore, having spent its entire life merely floating and consuming.
It has no core, it leaves no trace, it just evaporates.
Spineless, consuming without contributing, devoid of light. The poem explicitly states, when nobility retreats, the light in the eye is no more.
The jellyfish really represents a life lived entirely on the surface. They're dictated by external currents rather than the internal compass of their istiqamet.
It makes you wonder about the architecture of our own lives, doesn't it? Because we are constantly immersed in a digital and economic ecosystem that aggressively incentivizes us to be jellyfish.
Oh, absolutely.
Algorithms reward frictionless consumption. We are actively encouraged to just float along, go with the flow of whatever is trending, rather than doing the really arduous, often invisible work of carving a deep groove.
Right. Friction is viewed as a negative in modern society, but carving a groove requires immense friction.
That is the core conflict of the modern age.
The short-term rewards favor the jellyfish, but this text is fundamentally concerned with legacy. The contrasting path is the grooved legacy.
The true human.
Yes. The author argues that a true human is one who leaves a trace that survives their own physical death. And their capital isn't wealth or status.
It's the raw synthesis of trust and competence.
Exactly.
And the standard the text sets for this legacy is just beautifully simple. It's the competence that makes people say, if they did it, it's done right.
And the trust that makes people say, if they said it, it's true.
Imagine that being the entirety of your resume. Just those two sentences.
I mean, it is the highest possible praise a human can earn. You simply cannot build a community, a functioning business, or a stable family on unsure ground.
No, it all collapses.
The poem warns, trust is that soil. A heart unsure can build no heart in any land. If your own internal vault lacks integrity, you can't foster it in anyone else.
And this ties everything back to the author's warning about the pitch black night falling where truth ends.
Right.
There's a mandate tucked right into the final verses. Though you leave this world, let your groove be the seal. Let the echo of your trust be something the cities feel.
It's incredibly powerful.
You might just be one person tightening one metaphorical bolt in a massive chaotic world. But if you do it with absolute vakar, the entire city feels the resonance of that stability.
The text ends as a prayer, really emphasizing that we have to first secure our own grooves before we attempt to project that credibility outward.
You can't fix the world if your own house is a mess.
Exactly. You cannot legislate a society into being trustworthy. You cannot force a de facto situation to correct itself from the top down.
You have to thread the net yourself.
It starts and ends with individual responsibility.
We have covered an immense amount of ground today on this deep dive. We started by dismantling the illusion of normalized wrongs, really recognizing that time doesn't turn an illegality into truth.
And that we cannot be somewhat pregnant with justice.
Right. And then we explored the indispensable trinity of competence, trust, and virtue. The gold, the currency, and the unyielding armor required to survive without becoming an oppressor ourselves.
And we saw how the author brilliantly distills all of this into that unforgettable metaphor of the grooveless nut.
It forces us to confront the reality that arbitrariness, laziness, and a flippant attitude are not passive flaws.
No, they are active hammers striking against truth. They threaten the balance of a world where, as the text says, even matter weeps when things are misplaced.
Doing a job well, meticulously threading the nut, actually becomes our ultimate defense against the dark. It is our weapon against the spineless current trying to turn us all into jellyfish.
The mission is to carve an istiqamet so deep that long after we are gone, people still say, if they did it, it's done right.
But before we wrap up today, there is a final layer to this metaphor that demands consideration from you, the listener. We have talked extensively about your personal responsibility, making sure you possess the armor of virtue, making sure your own threads of trust and competence are sharp and deep, so that you are not the one producing a grooveless nut. However, society is an unfathomably intricate machine. Eventually, no matter how perfect your own craftsmanship is, your perfectly threaded bolt is going to encounter a grooveless nut made by someone else. You're inevitably going to be forced to engage with incompetence, with arbitrariness, with the established de facto wrongs of the industry you work in or the community you live in. When that collision happens, what do? Do you allow their lack of grooves to strip your own threads, slowly wearing down your integrity just to make the connection fit and keep the peace? Or do you remain steadfast, maintaining your vakar and forcing the rest of the failing machine to rebuild itself around your unyielding standard of truth? Take a close look at the friction in the connections of your own life and ask yourself, which metal is yielding?